Hello and welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Kaya's escape on the Buffalo Trail. Look out! Kaya cried. Two hawks spun onto his side and the cougar landed on the sand beside him. Kaya ran splashing up the stream, shouting and flapping her deer hide at the cougar. It clawed and bit at two hawks' arms and shoulders. Kaya lunged forward and pounded her fist into the cougar's nose. Ooh. With both hands, she grabbed fistfuls of sand and threw them into the cat's eyes. Blinking and snarling, the cougar released two hawks and began to back away. It was a thin, young cat with a lot of scars. Showing its teeth, it turned tail and retreated into the woods. Two hawks yanked off his deer hide. Kaya motioned for him to see the wounds on his arms. She washed away the blood and exposed the scratches, which were not deep. The deer hide wore, and Kaya's quick action had saved him from deeper slashes. Kaya knew how to stop the bleeding. Although it was almost last light now, she found the plant called the wapawalapa, good medicine for his wounds. She silently offered a prayer of thanks as she made the poultice of the leaves and packed it to the cuts. And she sat back on her heels and drew a deep breath. We must look out for each other, she sighed. You and I are not enemies. No, we are not enemies, Two Hawks sighed. We have to stay together, she added. We have to help each other. He nodded, his eyes downcast. You did a good thing for me. How do you say good in your language? Tots, she said at once. After a moment, Two Hawks repeated, Tots, talks, Kaya. When light came again, Kaya and Two Hawks made their way upstream, looking for a good place to fish. Kaya's breath clouded at her lips. During the night, a skin of ice had formed along the shore. How much longer would snow hold off? Here the stream widened into a basin before tumbling farther down. This was a good place to catch trout or mountain whitefish. Kaya untied a piece of fringe from her skirt to use as a sniggle. She lay on her belly by the pool and dangled the fringe into the water. Fish would think the sniggle was food and bite into it. She was quick, she could flip the fish onto the bank. Two Hawks tugged a piece of fringe from the side of his legs and lay down near her. He dangled the fringe in the water and waited. Almost at once, a fish bit the fringe. Expertly, he flipped a large trout onto the stones. Soon Kaya felt a tug on her sniggle. With the flick of her wrist, she flipped another trout out on the stream and into the bank. Good, they had enough for a meal. I'll build a fire, Two Hawks sighed. Kaya watched him choose a sharp stick for a fire drill. He put the point of the drill into a hole into the dry branch. Then he rubbed the stick between his arms until tiny sparks fell into the dried moss. Soon, a little flame burned, which she carefully fanned into a fire. Kaya silently thanked the trout for giving themselves to her and the boy for food. Then she cleaned the fish and placed them on the sticks by the fire to cook. When the fish was done, she and Two Hawks sat by the fire and ate them. She licked every bit of oil from her fingers. Never had anything taste more delicious than this meal they'd made together. As Two Hawks made a fire bundle to save the coals of the fire, a fine cold rain began to fall. Hurry, Kaya sighed. They had to find the Buffalo Trail before it was hidden by ice and snow. As Kaya and Two Hawks made their way uphill, the cold rain turned to sleep. Kaya pulled her deer hide over her head, though the sleep made it hard to see. She thought they'd been following the stream that would lead to Buffalo Trail, but nothing there looked familiar. After a time, the stream they followed was nothing more than a small creek racing down the mountainside. Bighorn sheep leaped across ledges above them. Slipping on icy stones, Kaya and Two Hawks struggled upward. At last they reached the top. Two Hawks gave her a hand, and she climbed up onto the trail that ran along the ridge. The trail spread around fallen trees, a path made by people on foot. Hoof prints were everywhere along it, too. "It's the Buffalo Trail," she signed to Two Hawks. Her heart lifted. Then she felt a stab of loss again. If only Speaking Rain were here with us, she thought. Up here the wind was bitterly cold. Kaya and Two Hawks pulled their heads down and started along the trail. Kaya saw horse droppings and the remains of fires, but the marks weren't fresh ones. With winter coming, travelers had already left the mountains for shelter in the warmer valleys. But Kaya knew enemies used the trail too. "Keep a lookout," she signed. How terrible if enemies could catch them out with home country only a few sleeps away. Wet and shivering, the two of them worked together to build a small lean-to against a rocky outcropping far off the trail. Because there was no water up on the ridge, they scooped handfuls of slate to suck. "If I had a bow and arrow, I could get us food," Two Hawks sighed. "But there's hardly any game of this high," Kaya answered. "We still have nothing to eat." Then she saw some pines were marked where some people had stripped the bark to get the soft layer. The underlayer was food for both men and horses when they had nothing else to eat. "Here is food," Kaya signed. She began stripping back the bark with her knife. As Kaya and the boy ate, wolves began to howl each other across the ridges. Kaya and Two Hawks held together for warmth like puppies. At first light, ice crystals gathered on frozen branches and then rattled in the wind. Kaya and Two Hawks lined their moccasins with moss to keep their toes from freezing. Their fingers were blue and their teeth clattered when they took to the trail again, but during the night the sleet had stopped. Even though she was cold, this old, worn trail comforted Kaya. She felt the presence of the people who had passed this way before her. After walking a long time, they came to a large cairn, a pile of stones that marked a special place. People had built many cairns along the Buffalo Trail. The cairns marked sacred places where spirits were very strong. Two Hawks went down the trail to scout their way, but Kaya stopped by the old cairn. As she stood by, she thought she heard the voice of spirits. Were they reminding her that her name meant she who arranges rocks? Were they telling her to build another cairn at the sacred place? She couldn't lift the stones, so she collected small ones and piled them up until she made a mound. She wanted to offer something of her own. She opened up her bag and looked inside. There was that magpie feather she kept. Magpie, her nickname. She took the feather on the top stone of the mound. All day and all the next day, they climbed higher and higher. Kaya and Two Hawks looked around as they walked, often glancing up at the birds and clouds for sign of the weather. Suddenly, Two Hawks pointed to a large tree off the trail. There, high in the tree, was a platform of branches. A bundle was tied onto the platform. Had hunters left food here for their return journey? Two Hawks climbed up the tree to see. He came down with a rawhide bag slung over his shoulder. The rawhide was from the top part of the teepee, darkened from smoke and made the waterproof. "This is a Salish bundle," he said. "My people hunted this side of the mountain. My people hid this food here." Eagerly, they opened the bag. Inside were dried camas cakes and pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, grease, and dried berries. They sat on the tree to eat the tasty, nourishing pemmican. This unexpected find would give them a string to push on. They were hurrying up along the trail when Two Hawks signaled for Kaya to halt. "Look," he said, "do you know that country?" Kaya looked and pointed. In that far, far distance, she could see what seemed to be a stretch of prairie. Was that the prairie where people sometimes dug camas balls? If it was, they were closer to home country than she thought. "Soon we will be with my people," she sighed. "Come on," Two Hawks answered. "Let's get a better look." Kaya's heart was light as they scrambled off the trail to a place where they could see more clearly. The prairie looked like a brown blanket laid overhead. Two Hawks was more eager than she could see it. He climbed a tall pine until he was back on top, leaned out, and shaded his eyes. With a sharp crack, the branch he stood on snapped under his weight. Crying out in surprise, he pitched backward and fell. He crashed down through the branches. With a thud, he hit the rocky ground and tumbled down on the far side. He cried out again, this time in pain. Kaya rushed to him. Clutching his ankle, he lay by his side. He crouched down and saw a lump on his ankle. When he touched it, she gasped. She handed him a stick to use as a cane. He seized the stick and tried to rise, but when he put weight on his injured leg, he collapsed in pain. He tried again, only to fall a second time. His face was wet with struggle. My ankle is broken, he sighed. Kai bit her lip. She knew she wasn't strong enough to carry Two Hawks more than a little way. Maybe he can crawl a little way, but if he couldn't, how would they get out of the mountains? She hugged herself. What should they do now? The cold wind whipped about them, and last light was coming soon. They needed a shelter there and a fire. Kaya collected dry twigs and sticks and handed Two Hawks in the fire bundle he'd made. Grimacing in pain, he unwrapped the coals in the fire bundle and set a building a fire. And as he worked, she gathered branches and built a lean-to shelter. How she wished for many, many hides to make her shelter wind-tight. They had the stylish food, but Two Hawks was in too much pain to eat it. His teeth chattered and his whole body shook. His eyes were wide with fright. How could Kaya help him? She lay down against his pack and put her arms around him to keep him as warm as possible. Still, he trembled violently, though he would try not to cry. Then Kaya thought of the lullaby that Speaking Rain had sung. Kaya put her lips close to the boy's ear. Hanoni, she sang very softly. Hanoni. When at last he did sleep, he groaned over and over. Somehow Kaya slept. She opened her eyes to a white world. Snow was falling quickly. Glittering flakes filled the air and drove into the opening of the lean-to. Snow covered the ground and weighed down the branches of the trees. Two Hawks tried again to rise, only to collapse onto one side. Kaya knew she couldn't carry him on the steep and icy trail. She'd have to leave him there, hurry on, and try to reach her people. If he stayed in the lean-to with some food, perhaps he wouldn't freeze to death before she turned some help. She crawled out of the lean-to and looked up toward the ridge. Drifts and blowing snow were all she could see. By now, snow would have covered the buffalo trail as well. As soon as she stood in the whirling white, she saw a woman standing under a pine tree in the slope. The woman was tall and strong, like the woman named Swan Circling. She wore an elk hide over her shoulders, and snow glistened in her braids. Light surrounded her, like the shining on ice. While Kaya watched, the woman turned and strode up toward the ridge, looking back over her shoulder from time to time. Kaya clutched her hide around her side and followed. Upward she climbed, wet snow falling onto her shoulders from pine branches. She brushed against them. Snow fell onto her head and into her eyes. She wiped her eyes, and when she looked again, the woman was gone. In her place, a wolf stood gazing at Kaya with yellow eyes. She saw the black lips of its raised ears and its thick yellow-gray coat. It watched her intently as she climbed up the ridge. When Kaya reached the top, the wolf trotted slowly down the slope on the other side. It paused now and then and looked back at her as if waiting for her to come along. Was the wolf a Waiakin? Kaya hurried after it, and then, with a bound, the wolf leaped into the trees and disappeared. Wait for me, Kaya whispered, with the wolf gone, the woods seemed much lonelier. As she searched the hillside of the wolf, she saw something moving. She ducked out of sight behind a tree and moved around the veil of the snow. Farther down the side, she made a horse and rider out in buffalo hide. Enemy? Friend? The rider led a pack horse and rode a large bay stallion. Could it be Runner, her father's horse? Could Tota be here in the mountains? Kaya went slipping and skidding down the hill, snow lying by her feet. Tota! She cried as she went. Kaya! He called back and turned the horses up to greet her. Then he was leaning over, lifting her up and putting her own horse in front of him. He wrapped her in the warm buffalo robe he wore and held her close. Daughter, you're alive, he said, in speaking rain. Is she alive too? Kaya put her face against Tota's chest. It was like a dream to be in his strong arms again. Speaking Rain's alive, but she's a slave of our enemies, she said. I escaped with a Salish boy, but he's broke his ankle. He's over that hill. She pointed. Tota's fur-lined moccasins from his pack and put them on Kaya's cold feet. He pulled another buffalo robe, wrapped it around Kaya's shoulders, and set her behind him on Runner. Leading the pack horse, they started back over the ridge to get Two Hawks. Kaya clung tightly to Tota's back. How did you find me? She asked. We were searching and searching, but found nothing, Tota said in his deep voice. And then 2 sleeps ago, a scout came to our hunting camp in the Lhasa. He'd come down from Buffalo Trail to the river because snow was coming. He told us he'd seen a new cairn at a secret place along the trail. The cairn was made of small stones, one someone with small hands might choose. Hands like yours, daughter. The scout said a magpie feather was stuck into the little cairn. I thought of your nickname, Magpie. I left our hunting camp and came up here to search for you. But if you hadn't seen me and come running, I wouldn't have found you in the snow. Were you watching the trail? I didn't know where the trail was, Kaya began. Then she stopped herself. She wouldn't speak of the spirit woman who led her away from the lean-to. She wouldn't speak of the wolf who had brought her in the side of the Buffalo Trail, and Tota either. If the wolf was a Waiakin, she would not tell anyone until the proper time. So much had happened to Kaya. How could she tell all of it? Where should start? Tota, the raiders traded away my horse, she said. She's a good horse, he said slowly. Perhaps you'll see her someday. And Two Hawks, can we help him get back to his people? She asked. We'll help the boy join his people again when the snow melts and it's time to dig the roots again, Tota assured her. Kaya pressed her face against Tota's back. She closed her eyes tightly and forced herself to say what she had to admit. It's my fault, Speaking Rain's a slave, she whispered. I thought of my horse before I thought of Speaking Rain's safety. But I made a vow I'd bring her back to us, somehow. Tota reached back and pulled the buffalo robe close to Kaya. We'll do all that we can to find Speaking Rain, but you must not blame yourself that you were taken captive. He said, you were taken far from home and you've endured much. But daughter, you are alive and well, and let us give thanks to Hunyawat that you're with us again. And that is the end of Kaya's escape. So, join me for the next story. Goodbye.